bar mitzvah this week, and it is the reading of the Ten Commandments. We gave him the good stuff. So we're going to read the stuff nobody ever talks about tonight. So I wanted to share these two passages that my guess is, if you've ever read through the book of Exodus, you probably just skim over these two and don't really worry about them. So here's the first. The story is the Israelites are getting ready. They're on their journey, and God is saying to them, I want you to build me an altar. Now, an altar, yes, in biblical times was for sacrifice, but toss that part out for now. The altar was like God's house. Like, I want you to build me a house. Build something for me. And God says, so there are two rules that come out of this. I think they're on the surface super strange. We'll see what you think. First is, if you build me an altar of stones, don't build it out of chiseled stones. Okay, that's the first rule. Second is, when you build the altar with steps, don't walk up the steps, otherwise your nakedness may be exposed. Yeah, we skip over these. See? You're looking at me like you haven't heard them before because you haven't. So first one, give us one reason. Somebody speak up. One reason. Why would God say build an altar not out of chiseled stones? Anybody want to guess what the problem is with chiseled stones? They did have chiseled. That's the great answer. It's just the opposite of the right answer. So, sharp edge, says the builder, right? So one would be safety, you might think. The problem was, so the idea was that the Israelites, God and the Israelites said, you shouldn't use, the rabbis talk about this a lot, you shouldn't use a tool made out of iron for something that is supposed to be life-affirming. So God's home should be something about living a long life. Iron are tools that are used for weapons. Weapons shorten life. So we don't want you to mix up the idea of something that lengthens life with something that is intended to shorten life. So we don't want you to chisel anything out of the stone. That's the first problem. The second problem was, what else would you chisel out of stone? God didn't like that a lot. Idols, right? It might become idol worship. All right, second rule. What does it tell you that you shouldn't walk up the steps to expose your nakedness? We get some good ideas out of this one. Yeah. Right, they were wearing skirts and they didn't wear underwear, it turns out, according to Exodus. So the first rule we learn from this one is, wear underwear. Yes, Nita? Interesting. So maybe God didn't want you to climb the steps because your ego would become, I'm up on the top step, right? So we could read this. We can skip over it. We're not going to do that tonight, though. So tonight, what on earth is this about? So here's my argument for it. I think that God is asking us in the Torah when we are about to have a serious conversation, because you wouldn't have a non-serious conversation if you were going to the altar, to the home of God. First, we have to be affirming of life, and second, it matters how we approach it. And yet, if we were to go into our own lives and say, okay, when I go to approach a serious conversation or a hard conversation with the people that I'm closest with, that are most important to me, sometimes those are the conversations that we bring the most weapons to. Those are the conversations that are more about us getting onto the higher level than other people being on the higher level. That when we go to have these very heated personal conversations, when we're passionate about something, that sometimes we do precisely the opposite. So I'd like to believe, whether this is what the intent of the text was or not, I'd like to believe it's actually a message to us. This is how you approach something when it's a hard conversation, when it's a serious conversation. You don't bring your weapons, and you make sure you pay attention to how you look when you're walking in the room, not just how the other person is. A quick story about by an author, Leonard Felder, wrote a book called, I think, directed at our world today and our divided political spectrums, but he titled it, We See It Differently. It's all about how we can come in the room and understand each other. But he starts the book by telling a story, his own story, of when he was 14 years old. His mother had died after a bout with cancer. And he went to his grandfather's house with lots of people. His grandfather was very traditional and observant as an Orthodox Jew. And all these people gathered around. It was the second night after the funeral. And then they called for the minyan to begin. And when they did that, there were so many people at the house that essentially what they did is, by saying it's time for the minyan to begin, they said to the women, you have to leave. And this 14-year-old boy was so hurt by the fact that this was supposed to be about his mother, and all of his mother's friends had to leave the room, that he yelled at them, at his grandfather and his parents, and he said, you can't do this. Mom wouldn't like this. So his dad pulled him by his collar and put him in the other room. His grandfather looked at him. He looks back on that and he says, I wonder if I could have approached it differently. Not that I was wrong, not that they were right or wrong either. But he shares that in screaming out in the middle of the room and taking all the attention away from what they were trying to do, he ended up also taking his father and his sister out of the room, and they sat with him in the other room while everybody else prayed. And he says that he regrets not being able to approach his grandfather quietly and calmly beforehand, explaining how he could honor both what his grandfather wanted to do and what he felt his mother would want. He regrets not being able to control himself and putting all the focus of his family on him, actually, and not his mother. And realizing years later that actually they didn't really get to grieve that night. Instead, they were just all angry. And he points to a passage by Maimonides. It's an interesting question. You got to really listen to the question to get the problem. It's like a riddle. My kids like to tell riddles. This is a Rambam riddle. Here's the riddle. The Torah says you're not supposed to curse, meaning like yell at. You're not supposed to yell at a deaf person. So what's the riddle, right? A deaf person can't hear you, so why would the Torah say don't yell at a deaf person? And Maimonides' answer is the Torah is telling you that you're not supposed to yell at a deaf person because the Torah understands the problem at yelling at someone is not only how they feel when you yell at them, it's how you feel when you yell at them. Because if you can yell at a deaf person and they don't hear you, their feelings aren't hurt. The Torah says you're sinning against yourself also. So, Judaism has no problem, by the way, with arguing. No problem with having people. Remember, I was reminded recently at Passover, we have all 4 children at the table. The one who doesn't say anything, the one who's always a little derelict, the wicked child, sometimes it's called, and we have the kids who answer the questions and do what is supposedly the right thing, right? All 4 kids stay at the table. The story, that Haggadah does not say kick that kid out. So here's what I think the end of this chapter of Exodus is asking us. What should we ask ourselves when we're walking up the steps to a serious conversation? First, are you wearing underwear? Which means, do you know what you look like to the people who you're about to approach? Your loved ones, your friends, your colleagues. And if your answer to that question is, I don't care what I look like to them, perhaps, as Torah would say, you're just exposing yourself. Not your nakedness per se, but your pain and your suffering. Second question, what are you carrying? Tools to change something to the way that you want it, or are you carrying questions to fix a problem together? Estelle Frankel, a psychotherapist and Jewish spiritual leader, refers to this as, what's your tone? Do you come with humility and empathy? Or are you coming to prove you are right? And finally, third question. Who are you doing this for? If your answer to that question as you get ready to enter the room is that you would say, you would say what you're about to say to someone who can't hear you, then perhaps you're just saying it for yourself. But if you're coming for a dialogue to seek potential in some new, unknown answer, then you're coming to extend life, not shorten it. Felder writes about his dream of what he wished would have happened that night at Shiva. He says, I imagine if I had taken 5 or 10 minutes in a side room to brainstorm calmly with my grandfather, we might have come up with several ways to remedy the tense situation. Possibly we could have agreed to do one traditional minyan and then one non-traditional minyan, inclusive of the women and inclusive of how I saw my mom's memory. And then that would not be what I nor they remember of that important night for our family, simply a night in which we argued, in which we were all suffering separately. And we have the strength to approach the hard conversations with those we love, but let us not approach them as if they are deaf, nor listen as if we don't want to hear what's said. Let's ascend the steps. Let's carry our best questions. Let's carry the ability to listen, not tools that shorten life, but tools that lengthen it. Shabbat Shalom. We'll turn to those words now as we'll carry our Torah around our sanctuary. We'll turn in our book to page 250 as we'll open our ark and we invite the Butlins to join us at the Bima.